Surely you see that this is for the best, Emeka. Family comes before ambition.
Perhaps you are right.
Auntie Ngozi had a method. She never asked for things directly. That was the first thing anyone who dealt with her learned. She would arrive at your door with a pot of soup and stay until the conversation reached the place she had been steering it toward all along. She had done this to Remi's father the year Remi turned 14, arriving with pepper soup and a tone of casual concern, and by the time she left, Remi's father had agreed to cancel the secondary school bursary application he had spent 3 months assembling. Too much competition, Auntie Ngozi had told him, her spoon moving slowly through the broth. And what will people say when she fails? Better to keep a child close where you can protect her. She had said protect the way people say protect when they mean contain. Remi's father, a gentleman who trusted the certainty of others more than the quiet of his own instincts, had nodded. He had believed her. 3 months of paperwork, dissolved over a pot of soup. But what Auntie Ngozi did not know was the girl she had been trying to keep small had already made a different decision years before, in a place where no soup could reach her. Wherever you are right now, whatever time it is, whatever you have left behind to get to the place you're standing, this story was made for you. Because every person who has ever tried to build something bigger than the box they were born into has met an Auntie Ngozi. Not always by that name, not always with soup, but the method is always the same. Love used as a leash. Stay with me tonight. This one is going to go places that are not comfortable, and that is exactly why it matters. If you are new here, if this story found you at the right moment, this is the right channel. Stay. The village of Novi Oolo sat on a hillside in the old eastern plateau, surrounded on 3 sides by cassava farms and on the 4th by a dirt road that had been graded once in 1989 and never again. Its one institutional building was the community secondary school, a rectangle of painted block walls, roof sheets the color of dry rust, and a yard where the harmattan blew dust through the open windows each November. The school had produced in 30 years 4 lawyers, 2 civil servants, a nurse, and 1 woman who went to study engineering in the United Kingdom and whose framed photograph hung in the headmaster's office with no nameplate beneath it, because everyone in the village already knew who it was. The community's governing fear was displacement, that what the land had built could be uprooted by the city, or worse, by ambition, and so it wore its love around its children the way you wear a hand around a flame, shielding, warming, and ultimately, if you were not careful, extinguishing. Remi Okafor was 22 years old and already becoming a problem. That was the phrase the village women used in their quiet assessments. Becoming a problem, which in Novi Oolo meant becoming too visible, too certain, too difficult to redirect. She was the kind of young woman who read standing up, who asked follow-up questions to teachers who were not accustomed to being questioned, who had been given a math prize 3 years in running and received it without performing the modest confusion that prizes were supposed to produce in girls. She had one daily habit that revealed everything about her. Every morning before the compound stirred, she sat at the small wooden desk in the room she shared with her younger sister and wrote in a black notebook. Not a diary, she would correct anyone who called it that. A logbook. Plans, calculations, scholarship deadlines, the names of contacts she had read about in newsletters she accessed on the school's single computer. She was building something quietly at 5 in the morning while everyone else was still dreaming. Her father, Remi Okafor, was a secondary school mathematics teacher himself, a soft-spoken man whose pride in his daughter was enormous and slightly helpless, the pride of a man who recognizes a force he can nurture but cannot direct. Her mother had passed 4 years earlier from an illness that moved faster than the clinic in the next town could respond to, and this loss had settled into Remi not as grief exactly, but as urgency. There were things her mother had wanted. There were things her mother had been talked out of wanting. She had watched this happen and made a private, wordless covenant in the weeks after the burial, sitting alone in the cassava field at the back of their compound with her black notebook open and nothing written in it. The notebook filled in the years that followed.
Auntie Ngozi was Emeka's elder sister, and she ran the compound with the authority that birth order confers in a place where birth order is taken seriously. She was not cruel in any obvious way. She fed people, she remembered birthdays, she could make a stranger feel immediately at home with the warmth of her attention. The danger was not in her cruelty. The danger was in her vision, which was small and certain and held no room for outcomes she had not pre-approved. She had decided sometime around Remi's 17th year that Remi's future should look like the futures she understood: an early marriage, a useful trade, proximity to family. She had not announced this decision. She had simply begun steering toward it, with soup pots and careful conversations and the particular patience of someone who is confident that time is on her side. The first trial. The first interference came the year Remi sat her national examinations. She scored in the 93rd percentile. She knew this because the school's deputy head, a woman named Mrs. Idwu, who had been watching Remi since she was 14, had called her aside on a Monday morning with a printed result slip and a look that contained both pride and worry in equal measure. The score qualified her for a federal merit scholarship, competitive, renewable, the kind that covered tuition and accommodation at the country's premier engineering university in the South. The application required 2 supporting documents, a guardian endorsement and a bank guarantee letter. Remi filled every other part of the form herself in the neat, compressed handwriting she used for anything important. She left the form on the desk in the parlor the evening she completed it, with a pen by it and a note explaining what the form was. 3 days later, the form was no longer on the desk. She found it in the kitchen, folded in a newspaper, behind the kerosene tin. The guardian's signature section was blank. The deadline was in 6 days.
She stood in the kitchen for a long moment, holding the form, listening to the compound sounds, the sweep of her aunt's broom in the yard, the morning radio, her sister's voice somewhere near the well. She did not confront her aunt. Not yet. She did not tell her father that evening. She made a different calculation. She had 6 days, and she needed 1 signature, and there was more than one adult in Novi Oolo who had watched her grow. She went to Mrs. Ido. The deputy head listened, then she picked up a pen and signed, not as guardian, she could not legally, but as institutional certifying officer, which the application's fine print allowed in cases where the primary guardian was unavailable. She also drafted a supporting letter on school letterhead because she understood that some doors needed more than 1 key. She handed everything back to Remi across her desk and said nothing except, "The post office bus passes at noon. Don't be late." Remi was not late. When Auntie Ngozi discovered 4 weeks later that the application had gone out, her response was not anger. It was something quieter and more deliberate. She sat with it, turned it over, and waited for the application to fail on its own terms. She had convinced herself it would. The scholarship was competitive. The odds were long. She told Emeka over evening food that Remi had been making plans without telling anyone, which in the grammar of their compound was a more serious accusation than defiance. Emeka had looked at his daughter across the room with an expression that was hard to read. Remi had looked back with one that was easier. She received the scholarship letter in the 2nd week of September. She read it standing at the compound gate on a morning when no one else was awake, and then she folded it, placed it in her black notebook, and went back inside to make breakfast. She did not tell anyone that day. She needed to choose carefully who learned first and what shape the news took when it arrived, because she understood, had always understood, that information in a compound has to be managed as deliberately as it is gathered. She told her father alone in the evening in the small yard behind the cassava, pressing the letter into his hands. He read it twice. His face went through several things in silence. Then he pressed both her hands together in his and held them for a moment without speaking, the way he had held her mother's hands at difficult moments. And in that gesture was everything: the pride, the fear, the love, and the grief for a woman who had wanted something like this for herself and had been talked out of it. "You have to go," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. Auntie Ngozi heard about the letter through the compound's own internal network. Nothing in Novi Oolo stayed private for long, and her response this time was public and swift. The following Sunday, at the family gathering that happened monthly at the senior uncle's compound, she raised the matter before 12 adults as a community concern. A girl of 22, she said, had no business traveling alone to a city she did not know to study a subject that had no obvious application in their circumstances. What was engineering? Who in this family had ever needed engineering? The roads in Nuevi Oolo were not fixed by an engineer. The cassava still needed harvesting by human hands. There was a young man from the Asika family who had been asking about Remi, a good family, stable, already building a house. Was this what they were raising daughters for? To send them away and wait to see what came back? The gathering listened, some nodded, some were quiet, in the way people are quiet when they agree but prefer not to say so. The senior uncle, a man in his 70s named Obi, rubbed his palms together slowly and looked at Emeka. Emeka looked at his hands. Remi was not at the gathering. She had not been invited, which was itself the message. But Mrs. Ido had been passing through the senior uncle's compound on an unrelated errand and had heard enough from the open window that she lingered until the gathering dispersed and walked directly to the Okafor compound with the unhurried pace of a person who had something to say that would not wait. She found Remi in the yard with the black notebook. "They spoke about you today." She did not soften it. Remi closed the notebook. "I know what was said. Your father said nothing." This was the sentence that mattered. She turned it over. Her father's silence was not agreement, she knew that, but it was not yet courage either, and courage was what this moment needed. "Obu utu akana eme ihe obu ne'ere ikere meke." What one hand can do, both hands can do with power. She would need more than her own. His name was Chikudi Obi, the senior uncle's second son, 41 years old, a structural engineer who had built roads in 3 states and currently lived in Port Harcourt and returned to Nuevi Oolo twice a year with the quiet purposefulness of a man who loves his home but has not been destroyed by it. He had read engineering. He had been, in fact, the first engineering graduate Nuevi Oolo had produced. The unnamed photograph in the headmaster's office was not the only photo. There was a second, smaller frame in the senior uncle's parlor, dusty and off-center, showing a younger version of the same man. He had never spoken about this publicly. The village preferred the narrative of the woman who went abroad. It was more dramatic, more instructive, more useful as a story about ambition and distance. His own departure in return had been folded into family history without becoming community myth. He sat with Remi for 1 hour in the yard behind the compound, and in that hour, he did one specific thing. He showed her the application documents for a full scholarship program at a university in Scotland that he had served as a professional reference for twice before. He told her what the process looked like from the inside. He told her which sections mattered most. He told her that the deadline was 11 weeks away. He did not promise to help. He said, "I will not start what you start, and if you start it, I will make one phone call." That was the price of his alliance. She had to begin. He would not begin it for her. She had started the application before he reached the end of the road. What happened in the 6 weeks between Remi's Scotland application and its outcome was the compound's sustained attempt to close the door before the letter arrived. It came in 4 parts, each quieter and more precise than the last. First, Auntie Ngozi went to the school and spoke with the new headmaster, not Mrs. Ido, who had transferred to a post in the capital the previous year, but a newer man who had a different relationship with community opinion. She expressed, in the concerned tone she had perfected, worries about Remi's mental state, the isolation, the obsessive behavior with the notebook, the rejection of her family's guidance. She did not make accusations. She used the word concerning 4 times. The headmaster, a careful bureaucrat, made a note he would later claim not to remember making. Second, a meeting was arranged between Emeka and the Asika family, the one with the young man and the building house, framed as a casual visit that had nothing to do with Remi, which meant it had everything to do with Remi. Emeka attended because refusing would have required an act of public opposition he did not yet have the language for. He sat through the visit with the obedience of a man who was going through the motions while the real conversation happened somewhere else in his chest.
Third, Remi's black notebook went missing from her room for 48 hours. It reappeared on the third morning under her bed with nothing removed. She checked every page against her memory, which was precise, but the act itself was a message. We can reach what you think is private. She felt the reach of it. She felt something tighten in her, not panic, but resolution. The hardening of something that had been moving towards solid for years and had now arrived. Fourth, and worst, on the morning Remi was to travel to the regional center to sit the application's required English proficiency assessment, a 3-hour test, non-refundable registration fee, single administration window for that calendar year, she woke to find that the household's one functioning motorbike had a flat tire. The driver who had agreed to take her the previous evening did not appear. The neighbors whose bicycle she borrowed for errands was traveling. It was a market morning, and everything that moved toward the market, not toward the regional center 30 kilometers away. She stood at the compound gate at 5:40 in the morning with her documents in a plastic folder and a look on her face that her younger sister, watching from the window, later described as the quietest face she had ever seen on a living person. Not defeated, not enraged, somewhere else entirely. She walked to the junction road and flagged the first commercial vehicle that passed and paid with money she had been saving in the lining of the black notebook for an occasion she had not named but had prepared for because she had always known on some level that the resistance would not always be visible and would sometimes take the form of flat tires and absent drivers and mornings designed to exhaust her before she had started. She sat the test. She did not know her score that day. She would not know for 3 weeks. She came home in the afternoon, did not speak about where she had been, made dinner, and sat at her desk in the long evening with the notebook open and wrote 3 pages of calculations and went to sleep. If you have been watching from the beginning and this story is pressing on something inside you, something about a door that was almost closed on you, something about a morning designed to make you late, then you already know why this story matters. Subscribe and stay close. The next part is where the compound's logic finally breaks. The lowest point. The letter from Scotland did not come on any significant day. It came on an ordinary Wednesday, delivered by the town's mobile post agent who sorted mail from a bag on the back of his motorbike and called names out loud at the junction. Remi's name was called twice because she was not at the junction. She was at the back of the compound hanging laundry. And by the time she arrived, 3 people had already seen the envelope and registered its international return address with the particular attention people give to things that confirm a fear. Auntie Ngozi intercepted it at the gate. She held it for a moment with the controlled face of someone deciding. Then she gave it to Remi without opening it, which was a calculation. If she had opened it, the act itself would have become the story. Instead, she released it and watched, and in her watching was everything she was planning to do next, regardless of what the letter contained. Remi took the letter to the room she shared with her sister, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened it. The letter confirmed full funding, accommodation, a start date 9 weeks away, a contact name, and a telephone number for a named coordinator in the international office. It was a full page of clean administrative prose that rearranged everything. She sat with it for a long time, not in shock, she had prepared herself for both outcomes, but in the specific stillness that follows the arrival of something you have worked toward so long, it started to feel theoretical. The theory had just become real and solid and terrifying and magnificent all at once, and she needed a few minutes with it before anyone else's response was allowed to complicate it.
The complications arrived within the hour. Auntie Ngozi called Emeka into the parlor and closed the door. Remi did not hear the conversation, but she heard its texture through the wall. Her aunt's voice low and measured, her father's voice responding in short sentences that grew shorter. When Emeka emerged, he did not come to Remi's room immediately. He sat in the yard for a long time, the way he had taught her to sit with difficult things, with his hands on the ground. Then he came to her door and knocked once, gently. She had the letter ready. She handed it to him before he could speak. He read it the way he had read the first letter, twice, slowly. His face moved through things she did not have names for. Then he looked up at his daughter and said, 9 weeks is enough time to prepare. This was the moment the balance shifted, not with argument, not with confrontation, not with the loud assertion of rights, but with a father reading a letter twice and choosing at last the harder word. Auntie Ngozi came to the room that night with a tone Remi had not heard before, not the certain warmth of the soup pot visits, but something exposed, something that had run out of strategy and found itself at the edge of its own limit. She sat things about loyalty and sacrifice and the memory of Remi's mother, and some of what she said had real grief in it, genuine and sharp, because she had loved Remi's mother, and the love was tangled up with the control in a way that could not be easily separated. Remi sat on the bed and listened to all of it. She did not perform coldness. She felt what was real in it and held it alongside what was not real, and when her aunt finished speaking, Remi said quietly, "I am going, Auntie. You are still my family." Auntie Ngozi left the room. The door did not slam. Obu ebene onye onachebe olua. It is each person who protects their own house. Not every protection looks like staying inside it. The exposure. The community learned in the way communities learn, gradually, then entirely, through the overlapping networks of market conversations, church fellowship groups, schoolyard exchanges, and the specific velocity of news that involves a young woman doing something unexpected. What they learned, in its assembled form, was this. Remi Okafor of the Okafor Compound, Mathematics Prize, 22 years old, had been awarded full scholarship to study structural engineering in Scotland, had organized the application herself over the period of a year, had sat a proficiency examination alone on a market morning, and was leaving Novi Oolo in 6 weeks. The story's complication, Auntie Ngozi's role, the missing form, the flat tire, the notebook, came out in stages, as these things do, through the witness of people who had been present at various points and who, in the reordering that the main news produced, found themselves repositioning what they knew and how they felt about having known it. The driver who had not appeared on the morning of the test was quiet for several days before telling someone why. The headmaster's note was mentioned by someone who was in the office when Auntie Ngozi had visited. Mrs. Idou, reached by phone in the capital by a community member who knew her, confirmed what she did and said it clearly. This accounting happened over 2 weeks, not in a single dramatic gathering, but in the ordinary spaces, the water pump in the morning, the provision stalls in the afternoon, the church steps on Sunday, and it had the quality of a slow audit rather than a confrontation. People recalculated. They went back through what they had nodded at in the Sunday gathering and felt their own compliance in it differently, and some of them sat with this discomfort quietly, and some of them spoke. The senior uncle, Obi, sat with it the longest. He was 73 and had seen many things take many shapes in Novi Oolo, and he had not, he knew, been on the right side of all of them. He sent a message to his son, Chukudwi. "The girl is going with my blessing." This was not nothing. In the compound's grammar, it was a formal correction, a public restatement. The senior uncle's blessing, delivered through his son, the engineer, reached Remi through Chukudwi on a Thursday evening, and it reached Auntie Ngozi through the same network, and the gap between them narrowed slightly, though it did not close. The women of the compound gathered 2 Sundays before Remi's departure, not as a formal meeting, not arranged by anyone in particular, but accumulating as things accumulate when people feel the need to mark a moment before it passes. They came with food,
They came with things: a good coat donated by a neighbor who had visited the north once and knew about cold, a small enamel bowl that had belonged to Remi's mother, a hand-stitched cloth from the oldest woman in the adjacent compound who said nothing but pressed it into Remi's hands with the significant emphasis of someone making a final statement. Auntie Ngozi was at the gathering. She sat at the edge of it, not at the center where she usually positioned herself. She did not speak for the first hour. When she did speak, she said something nobody had expected. Her mother would have gone herself if she had been given the chance. The yard was quiet for a moment. Remi looked at her aunt from across the compound. Something passed between them, not resolution exactly, and not forgiveness in any complete sense, but the acknowledgement of a shared grief, the complicated love that had been at the bottom of the harm all along, visible at last, too late to undo what had been done, but real enough to make the leaving less like fracture and more like departure. Remi Okafor stood at the gate on the morning his daughter left, holding his hands at his sides in the way he always held his hands when he was feeling things too large for gesture. He had driven her application to the post office himself the week before. He had paid, from his teacher's salary, for the additional documentation the scholarship had required. These acts, small and quiet, were the language of a man correcting himself, and Remi understood them as that. The commercial bus came at 6. Remi had one bag, packed with mathematical precision, everything considered, nothing forgotten, the black notebook in the outer pocket where she could reach it without opening the bag. She embraced her sister, who held on for an extra second. She touched her father's arm. She looked at her aunt across the yard. Auntie Ngozi raised her chin slightly, which in her vocabulary was the closest thing to a blessing she had left. Remi stepped through the gate. She studied structural engineering for 4 years. She was not the best student in her cohort. She was in the top third, which was, she calculated, entirely sufficient for the purposes she had in mind. She learned to live in cold weather with the systematic adaptation she brought to all new environments. First, the discomfort, then the adjustment, then the way the cold became background, present but no longer consuming. She called home every Sunday. She talked to her father about mathematics. She talked to her sister about everything else. She did not call Auntie Ngozi directly, but she asked about her through her father, and her father's answers told her what she needed to know. In her second year, she found, through Chukudwi's network, a summer placement with a civil engineering firm whose West Africa division was working on infrastructure projects in 2 countries. She worked that summer with the focused attention of someone who understands that the work is also audition, and she was hired before the summer ended. When she came home the first time, 18 months into her studies, Christmas season, Harmattan blowing the familiar dust through the compound gate, she brought nothing decorative or nothing showy. She brought her father a new calculator. She brought her sister a book. She brought Auntie Ngozi a good headscarf, chosen carefully, the kind her aunt preferred, which was its own message. I have not stopped knowing you. I have simply stopped being manageable by you. Auntie Ngozi received it with both hands. The compound adjusted. These things take time, and they take the evidence of outcomes, and outcomes require patience and distance and the willingness to let the results speak instead of arguing for it in advance. 2 years after Remi left, a girl from the compound's adjacent neighbor came to Remi's father asking about applications, then a girl from the provision stall family. The deputy head who had replaced Mrs. Idowu reached out through Chukudwi to ask if Remi would visit the school on her next trip home and speak to the students. She said yes. She visited on a Friday morning in the year of her graduation and sat in the same classroom where she had once received the mathematics prize and answered questions for an hour from students who were 14 and 15 and watching her with the particular attention of people who were trying to determine whether a thing they want is actually possible. She did not give a speech. She answered every question directly. At the end, a girl in the second row, small, precise-looking, wearing an expression of contained urgency that Remi recognized with her whole body, raised her hand and asked, "What do you do when the people who love you are the ones trying to stop you?" Remi thought for a moment. Then she said, "You go, and you call home on Sundays."
Onye watera oji watera ndu. The one who brings the cola brings life. She had brought something back, not wealth, not proof of triumph, but the particular kind of life that becomes possible when a single door stays open long enough for others to see through it. Here is the question I want to leave you with today, and I want you to sit with it honestly. Who in your own life has used love as a leash? Not malice, love. The real kind, tangled up with fear, because Auntie Ngozi was not a villain in the usual sense. She was afraid, and she had never been taught what to do with her fear except to wrap it around the people she cared for. That is the most dangerous kind of obstruction. If this story reached something in you, something you have been carrying, leave it in the comments. I read them. And if you are new here and this was the story that found you, subscribe. We tell stories that stay. On the last morning of her first home visit, just before the bus came, Remi walked to the back of the compound and stood in the cassava field where she had sat the night after her mother's burial, with the empty notebook. She stood there for a few minutes in the harmattan light, her hands at her sides, looking at nothing in particular. Then she opened the notebook to the last page and wrote one thing. Then she closed it and walked back through the gate to the road.